Good evening and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, whether you're here in the theater with us or joining us on our YouTube channel. Before we hear from tonight's guests about game design and the Constitution, I'd like to let you know about two other programs coming up here later this month. On September 11th at noon, political historian Sean Wilentz will be here to tell us about his new book, No Property in Man, Slavery and Anti-Slavery at the Nation's Founding. He'll discuss the political and legal struggles over slavery that began during the Revolution and concluded with the Civil War. Then on September 14th, in collaboration with the Assembly for Democracy in Vietnam, we will host a day-long symposium entitled The Vietnam War Revisited, which will explore the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese perspective. Check our website at archives.gov or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll find information about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. And you can find applications for membership at archivesfoundation.org, or there are applications outside in the lobby. 11 days from now, we'll celebrate Constitution Day, honoring the day that delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Though the day doesn't have the high profile of the 4th of July, at the National Archives, we have long celebrated the birthday of the founding document of our government. We've held many programs and activities to promote reflection on the U.S. Constitution and stimulate interest and discussion among people of many age groups. But I think I can safely say that we have never before had a program that analyzes the Constitution and the history of our political system using the science of game design. The records preserved in the National Archives form a vital documentary bedrock of our democracy. Citizens have the right to see, examine, and learn from these records in order to ensure their rights, hold their government accountable, and tell the story of the nation. To effectively put these rights into action, civic education is essential. In a letter written several years after leaving the presidency, Thomas Jefferson stressed the importance of education in the young nation. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. At the National Archives, we promote civic literacy and education in order to dispel ignorance about our nation's history and government. Over the last several decades, we have engaged with many audiences through personal contacts, print, audio, and video, and on digital platforms. Today, our panelists will reflect on game design and studying the Constitution. So let's hear from them now. Benjamin Stokes is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at American University and at the AU Game Lab. Previously, he co-founded Games for Change, the movement hub for games in the public interest. His research considers how games can strengthen cities, build community, and deepen our sense of place. He's worked at the MacArthur Foundation as a program officer in digital media and learning, and taught in the data science program at the UC Berkeley School of Information. Luke Peterschmidt is an award-winning game designer best known for his work on Bakugan, which won several major awards, including Toy of the Year and Property of the Year at the 2009 Toy Awards. In his career, he's done everything from game design to brand management to starting and selling companies. Luke has more than 30 published game design credits and is the writer for the Extra Politics series on YouTube. Denver Brunsman, an associate professor in the history department at George Washington University, writes on the politics and social history of the American Revolution and early American Republic. His book, The Evil Necessity, British Naval Impressment in the 18th Century Atlantic World, received the Walker Cowan Memorial Prize for an outstanding work in 18th century studies in the Americas and the Atlantic world. The recipient of numerous teaching honors, he was inducted into the George Washington University Academy of Distinguished Teachers in 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Benjamin Stokes, Luke Peterschmidt, and Denver Brunsman.
see. Good evening. So glad to have all of you here in the audience and those online. Welcome as well. I think this will be a fun conversation, but hopefully also one that's provocative. It has been, I think, for us in planning and thinking over some of these topics as we come here tonight. But I think maybe before we dive into too much of the topic at hand, just to set a little of the stage from where we come from in a less biographical fashion, but perhaps more from our personal experiences, maybe we can start, Luke, by just talking a little bit about whether school is a place where you learn things like game design. For you, is that where you learned it? And then we're going to talk a little about civic literacy as well.
Sure. So when I went to college a number of years ago, there were no degrees in game design. My degree is in chemistry, and you'll find that most game designers from my era have science backgrounds. In fact, for a time, I was at Wizards of the Coast, big game company out on the West Coast, and 3 of our game designers were literally Boeing rocket scientists who had left. One of them was developing the MERV system, the 10 nuclear weapons that from one missile, and then he went to designing card games because game design requires a certain amount of math. But now you can absolutely get degrees in game design, as you know, as you teach, and it's a different world.
It is. And maybe to turn it over to you, Peter, just curious, or Denver. I wanted to ask a question about where you were getting into games from your young childhood, or whether even in high school, this was something that you played. Did you play games?
Yeah, I guess just growing up in America in the in the 80s, I had the Atari 2600 and then the 5200, and eventually graduated to the Nintendo, and did card games and board games all along. And I think, though, I've really understood the power of them through my own kids and seeing their experience. And I had a fun thing happen several years ago when the game Assassin's Creed 3 came out, The Tyranny of King Washington. It's a counterfactual, dystopian game. It imagines that George Washington became king, that he gave in to the possibility and the pressure, and made war on the American people. I was interviewed by Escapist magazine, this online gaming magazine, which I didn't think a lot of at the time, but it turned out to be the one thing I've done in my career that got me cred with my kids and my students, more than anything else I've ever done. C-SPAN 3 and live streaming at the National Archives just doesn't do it for them, So it has a huge power, I think, on the current generation, and that's why this is such an exciting topic to marry the Constitution with game design. Games are culture. I don't want to jump on what you're saying, but games have turned into culture like movies and books and TV are culture. If you think of them as shared experience, it's our shared experiences for generations. Yeah.
And they are culture in terms of some of our national institutions, too. I think it's exciting to be here at the National Archives and having this conversation. I think there are other DC institutions, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, that have started to recognize games as art in just the past 10 years. But of course, games can actually be traced back quite a ways. Do either of you want to jump in on where you trace games back to?
So let me jump on a little different topic. You talked about games as culture. There's a game I wanted to bring up today called Trains. It's, we think of games as a casual hobby that we all do for fun. But games have reached a level of culture where they are now art pieces. And there's only one copy of this game, and it exists in a museum, and it's called Trains. And you walk up and you start playing this game, and it's about moving cubes around on trains. And you don't realize until you played for a while that what you're actually doing is moving Jewish people on trains to death camps. And it's a statement about how we follow rules without paying attention to where the rules came from. So I think we've reached a point on the forward end of your question to games being used to teach larger issues about humans as a whole.
Yeah, and there's a procedural kind of reasoning that happens with games as well, sometimes been talked about as kind of a procedural rhetoric, where if the argument you're trying to make is about how there's a cause and effect in things, how you do something again and again, a game might be a good way to make a procedural argument. Does that kind of procedural argument have traction in history? I think speaking each of our professional areas can be one way that we start to come together. Yeah. And I think that could be, I'm just kind of curious how procedural arguments, including things like the Constitution, which we're inching around to a little bit, how do procedural arguments, are they made in your field?
Yeah. Well, no, I think there's all these great historical examples, and kind of jumping into the Constitution, I think the Articles of Confederation are a great example that if you think about the design of different frames of government as a game, kind of what we're doing tonight, with the articles in the 1780s, the politicians, the statesmen at the time, just kept hitting a wall, right? They just kept kind of running into the same problem, that there wasn't the possibility to raise revenue, there wasn't the possibility to really govern in a national sense. And so, I think you see historical examples like that, where you kind of step back and you want to just, you almost want to speak through the documents and say, no, just go that way, or go that way.
Yeah, and we talk game design. That was like version 1.0 for a country, right? And then we moved on to version 2.0 of the Constitution. Yeah.
The rhetoric of being able to talk about game design 1.0 versus 2.0, I think one of the hopes for this conversation is that actually might be a language that resonates for some people. They're like, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of the Constitution in terms of version 1.0 or the next release, or is this a small update or a major update that we had? But I think that you've gotten to this a little bit in a web series that you've been doing. It has hundreds of thousands of views. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that could be interesting. It's part of why we're here, I think.
So I did a web series called Extra Politics. It is about taking the game design concepts and looking over our political system. And it's not about partisanship or policy. It's only about structure, because policy derives itself from structure. And I just tried to use the language of game design to explain why things happen, right? So votes are victory points, and a multiplayer game versus a massively multiplayer game. And then I see where that takes you. And I can't summarize the whole series here, but it's worth a watch if you're out there. And we even designed a game from that series called The Partisans, which is out on Kickstarter now.
I think that it is, again, very popular, and I think that this is also an argument about games as culture. When you have a form of culture in which a lot of people are literate, and I use that term deliberately, but also somewhat provocatively. We want civic literacy. That was some of the conversation, the opening remarks raised the question of civic literacy. We have a lot of people who are game literate. Is there a way in which those two literacies can speak to each other in some way? I think that's a little bit of our hope. You've written a textbook around some of the civic side of things. When you were drafting that, did you struggle with some of these challenges in trying to make AP history accessible to more students?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're taking these huge issues and you're trying to compress them into an understandable yet still intelligent way. And so I think you try to reach people any way you can. And so the particular textbook that I write for has a feature on film, for each chapter that tries to connect with people and with students. And I have a similar assignment with my students. It's a popular culture kind of review where actually games are one of the options if there's some kind of historical connection. And I think that opens a window. And then it allows students and citizens in general to think more critically about the past, about their situation, where they are in their society. Absolutely.
Well, let's turn a little bit to our game designer here on our panel and ask if, when you look at the Constitution, is there anything that you're just like, geez, well done, nicely balanced? Is there an aspect of it that you're impressed by?
So, there's a couple things. First of all, I love their design goal, which seemed to be to the people who have the power to decide who gets power were not the already powerful. That seemed to be a really good design objective. It seemed that was pretty much there. But probably the number one thing is that when we talk about game designers, we scope our project. That means how many features do we want in, how many do we want out. And when you think about when the time it was written, there's no functioning government. What are we going to do? So some of the issues they put off till later. You'll know it, the slavery they put off till 1808. Was that Article 1, 6 and 9?
Slave trade,
Yeah, so there's some things that they said we don't have time to deal with now. Yeah. And then if you're actually right here in the National Archives and you're downstairs like I was earlier walking the exhibits, there was a big thing about how Madison wouldn't sign the Constitution, I think, because he didn't see a Bill of Rights in it. And there was a whole movement to pass and then amend. Right? They said, look, we have issues we don't agree on. Let's table those. And when you're a game designer, setting your scope is critical. And I think they did a really good job at setting scope. They could have got bogged down for years arguing about things, and they said, nope, we're just going to move on. We're going to table that, and we're going to move on.
Mm-hmm. Does that resonate?
Yeah. I think, looking at it from a historical perspective, it's interesting because you do kind of think about the earlier experiments and the earlier attempts. And from a historical perspective, the Constitution accomplished something that the British failed at. I mean, you can look back at the beginning of the Revolutionary era and this question of sovereignty and how can two different entities exist, some type of central government and some type of local government. And the British answer to that is that they couldn't share sovereignty, that there could only be one place that was sovereign, and for them that was Parliament, or the king in Parliament. And so then you see the 1.0, Articles of Confederation, and their answer is that the states were sovereign. So you have 13 mini republics. And the result is that you really had a confederation. You didn't necessarily have a nation. So then the Constitution really kind of changed the game by saying, well, no, sovereignty doesn't have to be in just one place. It can be spread. And the notion of popular sovereignty, we the people, and that the national government can share power with the state governments, what we call federalism, is really genius when you look at it at the time, because no one else had figured that out. And if the British might have figured that out, we would be in Greater Canada right now, right? We'd all be Canadians. But it wasn't to be.
When you think about spreading that power out, in some ways that happened, we have three branches, think about that division, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily have the same visibility on at least the public stage, and perhaps the same kind of influence as the Chief Executive. Is that, just from a game design standpoint, is that, would you like to see more of that kind of balance, or is that, how does a game designer start thinking about that?
Well, you hate to poke holes at what the founders did because it was so amazing, right? But the alternate question, what you asked, what did they do well? You're kind of asking, what did they do not well? It's important to mention they didn't have the ability to play test, right? Game designers, we make rules and then we iterate and we have play testers and we see how it goes. They just took what was available, like you said, and there was no good example. So they didn't want to have a powerful executive, and they ended up with a powerful executive, right? That was a problem. I don't think, we talked about this earlier, they were prepared for political parties, for instance. Ask a high school kid if political parties appear in the Constitution, and they'll say yes, right? They're extra political entities, right? So I think those are the two places that it failed. So we've had playtest time, but the genius was they gave us amendments. So we can fix this. And I think we've gotten a little too hesitant to fix lately, but we can fix whatever the systems are that we need to fix.
So a game designer might immediately think, how can we fix this? Can we test it? Can we do something with it?
That's right.
It's a patch, right?
It's a patch.
It's a patch.
Right,
That's exactly right.
They're not amendments.
Is that something that's talked about when you teach history? Is that a mode of teaching history? Propose how you would fix it. Or is the hypothetical there a little bit of something that we don't want students getting into?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think Luke gave a great example. From the very beginning, they were adding patches, right? The original Constitution, one thing we don't realize, because it's been such a successful frame of government, we don't realize that it wasn't necessarily that venerated at the time. If there was a Gallup poll, it probably wouldn't have had a majority support, coming out of the box in 1787. But the agreement to add amendments, the first 10 amendments, what became known as the Bill of Rights, was hugely important. And then we see that throughout history. The country has grown more and more democratic, and so they've taken essentially what is in many ways a classical Republican structure that, the goal wasn't democracy in the original version of the Constitution, and there's been the changes. You have the 15th Amendment allowing formerly enslaved people of color to participate in the political system, and you have the 17th Amendment. The Senate is going to be elected by the actual people, not state legislatures. And the 19th Amendment, women can participate. So I would kind of think about all these as fixes, as patches, and then they've all been very effective.
Yeah, and for each one of those, we would call those a catch-up mechanic in game design. If there's someone playing the game who is under-powerful, we would put a mechanic in the game to increase their power level. And civil rights, the march of civil rights is essentially a huge catch-up mechanic. It's a way to take people who are not as enfranchised and bring them up to par with everybody else, which is one of the things I used in my series as an example for how I can use this catchphrase of game design to get people to learn more about history and politics.
So in some ways, games are a good model for looking at the Constitution because fairness is at their heart. Like a good game you might define in some ways as one that feels fair. Does that feel right to you as a game designer? And how do game designers test for fairness?
Yeah, so game designer is mostly a system engineer. If you have a factory and it's making ice scrapers, right, you're going to hire an industrial engineer and a mechanical engineer, and they're going to come in and they're going to open their toolbox of whatever skills those people have, and you're going to get more ice scrapers at a higher quality for less money. Game designer system engineers engineer for two things, fun and fairness. Fun is irrelevant when it comes to politics, but fairness isn't. So our box of tools that we can use to make things fair are not the same tools of other people. But fairness is at the core of it, and game design is a teachable skill. So putting game designer or game designer thinking into people's minds will create a better system. All the civil rights movements essentially were game designer thinking. There's a whole slate of things you could suggest as a game designer, but testing is extraordinarily hard. And some things game designers consider fair, people would never accept. If I told each of you to roll a die, a normal 6-sided dice, and that's the number of votes you get this season, right? You'd all think that's crazy, but it's fair. It's fair right up until you roll the dice. And then someone has a 6 and someone has a 1, and now it's not balanced, right? It's not ideal. But we look at randomness as fair, and it's probably not ideal to have too much randomness in politics. But yeah, testing is the hard thing. It's hard to test. The idea of the states as the test bed of new ideas is a valid one.
Mm-hmm. You were also talking a little about this idea of you don't know what's going to happen when the die is rolled, and that's part of what makes games engaging also, is that there's this element of uncertainty. In fact, I think that uncertainty is almost cultivated. It's an interesting question to think about democracy. We want more people voting. We want more people engaged. Do we need to make it a little bit more uncertain? Is this something that we think about? Did the founders think about the uncertainty as something that was in any way a good thing for getting people to turn out for elections, for instance?
So not balloon drops, but like spiked ball drops at political conventions. That'd be way more exciting. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's become a goal over time. I don't think that was originally the goal or the intention. It wasn't necessarily to get more people to vote, but that's kind of the part of the genius of the system. And you talked about fairness. Being a citizen in the United States or being a person in the United States and not having full and equal citizenship rights, I think motivated action, motivated protest, just as it did in the beginning with the American Revolution. White men at that time were born into a system of inequality. Some people were born with titles before their name. They were earls and viscounts and dukes and so on. And the American Revolution leveled a lot of those distinctions, most of them, for that particular group, and made it more fair. So I think as a person, as a citizen at that time, if you're thinking about society and your government as a game, you would be, I think, one would be more satisfied living in that society. But of course, not everyone had those benefits. And so that, I think that's the more perfect union aspect of it, adding more and more groups to that.
And up till that point, right, fair governments, was that a design goal of any other government?
The point, right?
I'm asking you, like, I don't know. Monarchies aren't fair. Like, they're way less
fair. By definition,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But there were certain values around fairness and democracy as kind of an egalitarian approach, or even kind of the radical notion that power should be distributed equally. Those are in the Constitution in some ways, and I feel like there's a way in which enacting the Constitution through formal means is a great first step. On the other hand, there's a lot of conversation in our country now about maybe informal and formal need to go together in interesting ways. I mean, we are here, 3 white people for the most part. Like, I don't want to presume too much, but I think like
Right.
there are real questions about like the informal. How did we get here? How do we make the playing field more fair, even if the system says everyone has one vote? There are a lot of people that doesn't feel fair. So I'm curious, as a game designer, are those ways of thinking about fairness beyond the formal rule structure? How do game designers think about that?
Yeah, so one of the challenges governmentally of fairness is we are in the middle of a game that never ends. Changing the rules in the middle of a game is always going to advantage one side or the other. If the rules in football get changed to where you can't lead with the head anymore on a tackle, that means the team that has the best I lead with my head tackler is going to suffer, right? They'll be less good, but the other 15 teams will be better, but they'll be outvoted 15-1, and the rule change will happen. We have essentially a two-party system. Any change in line to what we're doing, even if it's done for the most nonpartisan reason, is a tough sell because it's going to hurt one team or the other. So before we even get there, we have to have a discussion, and we have to agree as a nation on our definition of fair. Because it's always going to be a challenge to have the rules changers be the same people as the game player at the same time, which is an issue we have. Like regularly scheduled constitutional conventions would have been the game designer way to do this. We would have come together every 30 years and said, we're doing it again. And everyone who participated in that wouldn't be allowed to run for office. That's how we would have fixed that problem. Mm-hmm. But nobody asked me.
So should we have asked him, maybe is one of the questions. Like, is this a good time in our moment in history to say, let's turn back to game designers and ask, should we be having our structures around evaluating democracy different in some way? Is that a question?
Yeah, well, they did provide the provision for amendments. And so we can actually, if 2/3 of the states come together, we actually could have another convention. It's hard to imagine 2/3 of anyone in America agreeing on something right now. Yeah. And I think that might be one of our difficulties. And you mentioned the party system. This is something that the framers didn't anticipate, or they were really in denial about, that there would be parties. And so it really throws a wrench into a lot of things. I was just looking at our amendments. We've had 27 amendments to the Constitution. I think the largest span is from 1804, from the 12th Amendment, to 1865, the 13th Amendment. And right now we're just at about just a little over 25 years since the 27th in 1992, which was kind of an easy one, that Congress can't give themselves raises and get those raises in the same session. You have to go back earlier to 1971 for the 26th Amendment, which allowed 18-year-olds to vote in the Vietnam era. We're coming upon 50 years for that. If you think about it. So we're kind of hitting historical points of inaction, you might say, on constitutional change. And it's hard to think of the country agreeing on something right now, getting 2/3 of Congress and getting 3/4 of the states to ratify a change. It's hard to imagine right now what that would be.
And I would argue during those 50 years, we've had more societal change than the previous 1,000 years, right? There should almost be a constitutional amendment regarding phones at this point. I don't know, but we've had amazing changes in the last 50 years for no changes in our form of government.
Yeah.
The moment of bringing together designers, and the Founding Fathers they weren't referred to as designers, game designers as such, but there was also kind of a design space that was created, even down to the point, a detail I read when I was preparing for this that I loved was that there was soil put out around where they were meeting so that it would be a little quieter, so all the carriages running by wouldn't make so much noise. And I thought, oh, that's very considerate. It's not just like closing all the doors and windows to make sure they have some privacy. Yes, it's partly about the privacy, but also setting up kind of a quiet space.
Yeah.
But it also wasn't a particularly open public process in its own way.
No.
Is that I wonder, as a game designer, do you design games in public, or is it also kind of a private process?
So mostly private until you're ready to play test. So yeah, design by fiat of all existing players would be an interesting thing to try, but probably fail horribly.
Every designer I've met, when I say game design by committee, they're pretty much like, that's not a great idea. Like democratizing the game design process is an interesting challenge. Like I don't know if that leads to great game design, especially if we think of games as art. Then there's often an artist behind it who's going to get credit. So there's some interesting games as large systems. How do those evolve as well?
Yeah, but if a bunch of game designers agree on what the game is supposed to do, we call it the designer's intent, that it helps. I mean, the biggest computer games of today have 1,200 people working on them. So there's a way to do that and do it effectively. But they were going from no government to government. That sounds like a much harder job than making Call of Duty 9.
In terms of the designer intent, do you feel like there was a shared designer intent when we talk about the Constitution?
Yeah, I think for the most part. I think in total there's 55 people that we call framers, delegates to the Constitutional Convention. There's never that many at one time. And in some ways it was fairly self-selected. These are groups of people that I think today we would identify as nationalists. These are people that thought there needed to be a stronger national government. Of that number, there's only 3 that ultimately don't agree, that don't sign, that leave. So I think there was some shared goal. There's even a handful of those delegates who simultaneously served in the Confederation Congress, the government that was being replaced. So these are people that really thought there needed to be change. And and in terms of the test, I think it's when they publish the Constitution after September 17th, 1787, and it goes to the newspapers, and then you have the ratifying conventions. And that might kind of be your beta test time. And that was a difficult process. And that's part of, I think, that's one of the most democratic aspects of the Constitution. And that's something that gives some truth to the idea of popular sovereignty, is that it was ratified by groups of people and not sitting legislatures. So I think that was innovative for the time. And that's one of America's contributions, really, to the world in terms of constitution making, that idea of popular ratification process, which is kind of a market idea. Maybe. Yeah.
It is, and markets are an interesting question with games as well, because a lot of games, we assume that they're a consumer kind of product, where approval is one per person by purchases. So if it's great, we'll test it, we'll put it out there, we'll see if a lot of people buy it. But that's not true with all games. There are some games where the rules change based on the server you're on, where you could actually have some kind of localism or even group adoption of a set of rules. Mostly this happens, I think, with online kind of massively multiplayer games, but sports leagues might have some of this behavior as well. Is there a tension between people that are thinking kind of about sports games in terms of sports leagues and the people that are more in the consumer game space? Do we need to break this down a little bit more? Or is the game design community of one mind on how we think about popular adoption of games with rules?
That's a tough one. So there is definitely a huge distinction between a spectator sport and a for consumable game that you buy and play. And there's a huge difference between a single player game and a 2-player game and team games. I think politics is most like a spectator sport. We have players in the field, those are the people we elect. We have players in the sidelines, those are the lobbyists and the interested parties who organize. And then we have the voters in the stands. And at any point, if it's not working for any one of those 3 groups, there'll be a rule change. Spectators have amazing power in spectator sports, but individually they have very, very little. A lot of mathematical analysis has been done on the actual power of your vote, and it just misses the entire point, right? It takes all of you to make the change. Products you buy on a shelf don't have that dynamic. They're pretty much bought for entertainment, and they're one-and-done general products, I would say.
I think that helps maybe to make the comparison if we're trying to think about game systems and democratic systems. Where do we look for interesting propagation of rules? How do we compare them in more meaningful ways? This idea of a spectator who also finds the experience meaningful is one that we do talk about now in terms of voting. Like, do we find the experience of voting meaningful? Can we get more people voting? I hear this a lot in people that are talking about civic education, civic literacy. How do we prepare more people to be ready Americans for their civic lives? But do we talk about it in terms of spectatorship? I'm kind of curious, how does this come up when we talk about this?
Yeah, or thinking about it as part of a game, right? If when this video goes viral and everyone sees it, and I think more young people in particular, if they kind of think about that they're participating in this system, and they are spectators, but they're participants, right? They're part of the game, and as you said, they can force changes. They can force changes in rules, changes in behavior, any number of ways, right? That we can think of, and so I think thinking about that way, they might imagine themselves being less powerless than maybe you sometimes hear people don't participate in the system. They feel apathetic because they feel outside of it. That they're not part of it.
Yeah. If politics were a true spectator sport, like let's say basketball. We would have invented the 3-point shot, right? The 3-point shot was invented for basketball to make the game more exciting to watch, or the 2-line pass in hockey. Those things were done because the league said, we need more engagement by the spectators. The spectators aren't loving this anymore. we don't have a league that says that right now, that says we don't get enough voters. What can we do to get more people to vote from a structure standpoint, right? $5 off your taxes. I don't know, pick a thing, right? Something.
Voting holiday or
make it
or
3
weekend,
days.
yeah.
Problem again is always going to be with those changes, it's going to help one of our two parties more than the other, so there's going to be national resistance. Gerrymandering I find to be super interesting because nationally everybody hates it. Everybody, both sides of the aisle, hate it. Locally it becomes oddly popular in small little locations. If that was an amendment that was put up, some clever fix for gerrymandering, I don't know what that would be, it would pass 99-1. But that local desire to keep it is very strong.
I wonder, to flip it on its head a little bit, whether we sometimes get into trouble by trying to tell people they do have power for a reason that game designers would never make that mistake. We tell people, your vote really matters. If we go too far and people start thinking, but then they can see the system and they realize that in a lot of ways we are spectators. And when the rhetoric is too strong on empowerment, do we actually create a kind of cognitive dissonance where people say, this is a really frustrating democracy. I keep being told my vote matters, but I'm not an idiot. In a game, we just call it a spectator, and then it's okay if people say, if I just eat this Cheeto 3 times, my team's going to win. People come up with all sorts of crazy things about what they do on game day, wearing their shirts when they're at home watching the NFL. Very clearly not that related to actual cause and effect. But there's a kind of understanding that probably isn't related. I think that we lack some of those mechanisms, those rituals almost in our democracy, and I wonder whether being more honest with the spectator notion could be useful.
Yeah, possibly. And I think it goes back to the design of our system, that parties weren't anticipated from the start. So we don't have a parliamentary style system where, depending on the number of votes that a party gets, they get a certain share of the power. We have a winner-take-all system, which is great if you're the winner, but it can be discouraging. And so the benefits of our system are a little more abstract. And so, any presidential election, pick your election, whoever might win. Half of my students are moving to Canada, right? And what I tell them is, don't bother. You don't need to move to Canada because James Madison has your back. Because the benefit of the American system is it protects the minority, that it's, the party in power, whoever's in control, it's hard to get things done by design, right? It's a difficult system. But that's kind of an abstract benefit as a citizen to say, oh yeah, gridlock is working for me. I think from an intellectual perspective and an academic perspective, you can see that. But from a citizenship perspective, it can be frustrating. And you might feel better if actually, your group, whatever that might be, had 10% of the seats in Congress.
Yeah. I wonder whether game culture might be actually making this a little bit worse, because there are a lot of video games where you're given a particular power. So even sometimes talked about as God view. In SimCity, you're not just mayor, you're controlling things that the mayor never could possibly control, and both the time horizon goes faster than you would be able to stick around and wait for, and your powers go more broadly than any mayor could actually engineer. So I'm just kind of curious, as the game representative of the two, are you at all worried that game culture is perhaps setting expectations of we should be able to take control of the whole system?
Well, one of the things that you often see a president get kudos or blame for is the price of gas, which the president has almost no control over the price of gas. You have to do something pretty extreme to have something on the price of gas. And I think that we have, in our mind, thought the president can do almost anything they want to do it and do it cleanly. I will say our rules aren't very tight. So sometimes the president can do something and everyone looks around and goes, can he do that? Is that a thing? And there's no clear answer sometimes. Because as good as the Constitution is, it doesn't give things like deadlines. You have to, as the Senate, approve a Supreme Court nominee. How long do you have? 30 days, 30 years? It's not clear, right? So we have some fluidness in our interpretation that I think is a little bit scary. And then I think we could use some buttoning down on.
Is that ambiguity from the historian of the Constitution a good thing? Do you see this going back to George Washington as something that we didn't know exactly what the president was going to do? And I think a lot of people came together because they're like, but it's George Washington.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Article 2 is being written in the Constitutional Convention, they're looking at George Washington, the president of the convention, and everyone sees him as the first president. And I think one of the things in the scholarship today, and thinking about our executive and why it's so powerful, it's because they imagined that Washington was going to be the first president, and that he could be trusted with a lot of power. They gave the American president kingly powers. Think of some of the superpowers of the president, the constitutional ones, things like the pardon, being the commander-in-chief, the veto. At the time, in the 18th century, late 18th century, there's only one other person on the planet that had those powers, and that was King George, George III in England, who was a constitutional monarch, and he hadn't actually used the veto, and in fact, no English monarch had since the Glorious Revolution of 1688, because there was a sense that it would create a constitutional crisis if they vetoed a law of Parliament. George III tried in the 1790s. Sure enough, it created a constitutional crisis in England. George Washington had 2 vetoes during his presidency, and along with so many other things, set the precedent for presidents doing that. So, but to get to the question, I think there's this term in gaming. I'm picking up on some of this exploits, or things things that can be used. And I think much of Article 2 is exploitable, to be honest. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that aren't clearly defined and have taken generations of restraint, beginning with Washington, and norms have built up, and those kinds of things. Yeah, absolutely.
So if you wanted to tighten in a part of the game design that had been left too open for exploits, obviously it'd be nice to do version 3 perhaps, but let's not get into that. I don't want to suggest revolution.
Revolution.
But separate from that, the question of how you have a game as a service, something that is a big ongoing game where people are paying subscription fees. How do those games tend to evolve? Is this something you've watched a bunch?
I love the thought of taxes as subscription fees. I think that's fantastic. I'm going to use that next season. So we have that problem. Changing our rules is going to hurt one side or the other, but I believe there are still things that both sides can agree on, and I think it's going to take a raft of people across the aisle, I know this sounds like Pollyanna talk, especially in this town, to agree on making some fixes. And fixes sounds like they did a bad job. There's no way someone in 1780 could have thought of the world we lived in today, and we just need to fix some of the things we have going on. Voting security is an obvious one. I think there's an interesting argument to be made now that Congresspeople are federal elected officials, and that the federal government should be able to set the rules for how they get to office. Which is why that's interesting to me is, this was an amendment suggested by another game designer friend, is it starts from a place of defining what a congressperson is. It doesn't start with an end result. Right? It starts with, it's absolutely taking away a state's right and moving it over, but I think we live in a world now where national governments have, across the globe, gained more power, and to be more effective, we might need to do that. I am not suggesting this is a good idea to anybody out there, but that thought process I really enjoyed, because it started from, let's take a look at something fundamental. How does a senator or a congressperson become a senator or a congressperson? Are we happy with that process? Does it make sense in the modern era that we do it the way we do? If not, let's fix it. And then you can sort of get outside of the partisanship once you get agreement on a topic like that. But that's what I would do if I was game designer Constitution 2.7 or whatever we're now, 2.27. I guess we are.
There's a sense that process really matters in game design.
Process,
and I think that's an interesting question, as we think right now there's so much conversation about outcomes. What would it mean to step back a little bit from outcomes in our democracy and say, let's have a process conversation? I think gerrymandering is having that conversation right now. They use that term and people agree, and they agree mostly in terms of process. But I think that perhaps we could use more of that. Do we see more opportunities for talking about process right now? Or how does that come up when you talk about with your students, for example?
Yeah, no, I think I think in our democracy, that's a safer discourse to have, to think about problems, and like you said, talk about them in a nonpartisan way. That this just isn't working. What's a potential solution that hopefully would have input from all sides. And I think process is a good place to start with that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a term in game design called there's game theory and there's game design. Game design is making the rules, and game theory is using those rules to your best benefit. A good friend of mine with a doctorate in game theory says that if you learn a little bit of game theory, you turn into a jerk. And that's absolutely true, because game theorists try to twist and turn every rule they can for their advantage, even at the dissatisfaction of society. What beats a bad game theorist is a good game designer, because they can make those things not happen. And my goal is that people in the political realm think more like game designers and think more process-oriented, because it will create better outcomes for everybody, I think.
And that was the original impulse, if we think about it, that that America and the founders created a republic. They did that by design. The Latin root of that, res publica, is the public thing. There was an idea that there had to be a certain amount of self-sacrifice in a republic, that everybody was in it together. That's why they didn't envision political parties, because in their minds, political parties were in it for themselves. And I think, I think there was a certain inevitability about political parties, and they're necessary for a lot of different reasons. So I think the trick that we have is to get back to that original impulse, the sort of common good, without losing the changes and the evolution we've had in our system. The more democratic system, the idea that everyone participates, but somehow find a way to marry interest group politics, self-interest with the common good.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's put them in a room and spread dirt so no one hears the cars going by.
It'll be a movement. It'll be a national movement. It'll be amazing.
Quieter streets could have an effect. That could be our civic
We'll become
term.
a very Zen-like people. Yeah.
We talked a little about challenge at the beginning, how games have challenge. In fact, I think you were defining them in that way. Is that one of the ways we might define them?
My favorite definition of a game is a challenge you do for entertainment purposes. There are lots of definitions for a game, but
we'll let everyone think on that for a minute.
Yeah.
And I think an interesting kind of parallel in that, in civic space, John Dewey has talked a lot about the public and its problems, and in fact has argued, I think compellingly, that people don't just engage in civic life because that's what they do on Tuesday night. There are some crazy people who do that every Tuesday night, but most people have things to do on their Tuesday night, and he argued that people come together in response to problems, that publics arise when there's something that needs to be taken care of. So problems are actually what leads to civic engagement, as opposed to, I think it's a great thing to read the paper every day. We might do some of that too, so there are civic behaviors and patterns and norms, but real engagement often comes in response to problems. And I think in some ways, both of the major parties have done a great job of saying the problem is those guys. And so we're organizing our problems around partisanship. That's bringing people together. I'm just kind of curious about this, do we have something of a Venn overlap between how game designers see problems and how we might see problems in terms of the Constitution? What can we do with this?
Well, when you have a game design that you didn't have time to play test, like we talked about, you're trying to anticipate player behavior. Like, how are people going to interact with my rules, and is that the way I wanted them to? I grew up around here. Agronsky and Company was what me and my mother watched. And politics here, national politics is local politics when you live here. Then I moved to farm country Pennsylvania, and the difference in how people engage with their political system was drastic. And it was not a question of intellect. It was just a question of how much time did they spend engaging in civic responsibilities and government. They had other things to do. I think we need to look at how people participate, because we have we call them player profiles in game design. This country is full of a lot of different player profiles. And there's a talk about the elite coast and the flyover states, but there are very strong regional differences. The folks in Seattle, when I lived there, were very different than the folks here. I think we need a better understanding of what it means to be an American in all of the parts of America. And I would encourage civic duty at the more the educational level. And plug for the National Archives, they do great programming here about civic life. So there we go.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
In fact, we even heard of some escape rooms that they've been doing here at the National Archives, which is a pretty fascinating idea, to come to a place where you have some of the core documents and send young people, or actually people of any age, into the archives looking for solutions to puzzles.
Yeah, finding Nicolas Cage. He's in here somewhere.
He's the one person that knows where the Constitution
That's
goes at
right.
night,
He
right?
knows.
Yeah.
He knows.
Are there games that we wish we had more of our young people playing? Is there a commercial game about politics and civic life that we wish people were playing more? Okay, that maybe have been a leading question, or a non.
There's a YouTube video series.
But seriously, are there games that are either people should be playing more, or that we would want to make as part of the standard high school civics curriculum, which exists in a few places. Florida now has made it a statewide requirement that we teach civics in high schools, but most states not so much. It's actually not something that is required nearly at the level of math and science. And I'm just kind of, how do we think about games in what we're currently doing?
Well, I think a great teaching tool, and we're talking about the Constitution, and it's a great example, is role-playing, right? There's different role-playing exercises and games, and talking to teachers when I work with them in workshops, this is a very powerful lesson, that a student adopts the identity of a delegate, or a group of students come together and adopt a certain person or a certain position, the Virginia plan, and to do the simulation. So if you get groups together and one group is the Virginia plan and one's the New Jersey plan, and you have the Hamilton plan, and then maybe just to make it exciting, you create a group of anti-federalists, throw them in the mix. And have the students actually kind of go through the process that the framers did can teach a lot, because any one of those plans, if they would have stopped just with one of those plans, I think it's fair to say the government would have failed. There were so many flaws in the designs of any one of those plans. But by going through the process and learning about compromise, and essentially what Luke was talking about is that in our current political moment, we need people to be big enough to compromise. And they were in that period, and it was hard. Today we look at the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, which essentially created the world we live in today in America with, House of Representatives that's based on proportional representation, a Senate that's based on state equity. There was a lot of frustration when that deal was struck. At the time, Alexander Hamilton had left the convention, and George Washington wrote him a letter and basically said that he despaired of even coming to Philadelphia, of even being a part of this whole process, because he was part of the nationalist group, the group that wanted a much stronger national government. And they thought by keeping even one element of the Articles, that state equity in the Senate, that they had lost, that they had given up. But the fact that he came back the next day and he said, okay, well, I don't like this, but this is the deal. This is what we need to do. That's leadership, right? That's a certain amount of maturity that made our system work. And so I think imparting that in students in some way, having them see how that worked can be very powerful.
Yeah, even at a younger age, my wife's a fourth grade teacher, and she did this game with her kids where someone came in. One year it was me dressed all in a business suit, and I pretended to be a developer, and I was going to take this park, and I was going to build this park up to be great. But then someone else came in and said, oh, but if you do that, all the animals are not going to have anywhere to live. And everybody had a card that was who they were. It was a role-playing exercise. Half the people were kids, half the people were animals. We take a vote, and my plan loses, and then the teacher, my wife, says, oh, hold on, animals don't get to vote, let's vote again. And then the vote plan works. And the idea was about voting for, the idea that we as a group sometimes have to vote for things that are in the interest of people outside of our group. This is true of anyone who votes for education or has thoughts on education funding. Generally, voters are out of school. And we're yet, as a community, even if you don't have kids, are voting for how kids in the nation should be treated. And I thought that was a great lesson. And boy, those fourth graders got mad. They were very mad when they found out owls couldn't vote.
When will the expansion of voting privileges?
That's the last
We are not
Our union's
fully,
not perfect yet.
It is not. It is not. Very few boards of directors which affect kids have any democracy at in terms of young people. This is a question I wonder, we're having this conversation here. Would you like to invite a game designer into your classroom when you're teaching AP history, for example? Is there something in that exchange that you're seeing in these conversations that often doesn't come through in a textbook?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just being a part of this experience and interacting with Luke and you and seeing just a different way of approaching the document has already affected, I think, how I'll teach it and have students look at it. So no, I think it's, and I think you can apply it to a lot of historical moments. I think the Constitution's a great one, but there's a lot of periods that you can kind of bring this type of theory into it, and it opens up understanding, and that's the goal as an educator.
So maybe we'll take the flip side, because that was perhaps too much of a positive leading. There was no way you could answer that. But what is our hesitation about looking at game design, bringing game design too much with the Constitution? I think there are probably a lot of people like, oh, that's a clever panel that they put together there at the archives. But of course, we're not really going to do that. We're not really going to bring game designers as consultants onto the Hill. How many campaigns are employing game designers for anything other than let's gamify turn out the next vote? Like, we're not really necessarily, there's a hesitation there. Is that something that either of you feel as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So games are juvenile in most of our minds. The science of game design is not respected as a science. Even if you think it as an art, it's not really considered like an art process. My definition of game earlier was a challenge you take on for fun. Politics is a serious business, right? Sometimes I say things here that might be very lighthearted and casual. I don't mean them in the lighthearted because they will have real-world effects. So while the system engineering part of game design, the cleverness and the bag of tools we use to make things fair is totally appropriate, this sometimes casual attitude of making things fun is sort of cast a shadow when you try to bring that into other elements of your life, be it politics or business or anything else.
Or it's like anything, it can't be the only way, right? It can be a tool, it can be one thing that you bring in. Yeah. But history at root is the study of the human, and while this is fascinating and sort of predicting human behavior, almost in a social science kind of way, there is certain emotion that can be lost, personality, the quirks of humanity, and so I think just bringing these things together makes for a really rich way of looking at the Constitution.
A nice divide in terms of games is also to think about them in terms of serious systems, simulation, and you talked about role play, and then the playful side. And we can actually start dividing a lot of games into that. We could even look at something like the finals in a grand tennis match and ask, are those players being playful? And actually generally not. They're not playing with the rules. They are there to win. And they are going to very carefully follow things. On the other hand, kind of playfulness, that attitude might open up some of the space for people to talk to each other at the local level. And I think that there are a lot of cities experimenting with kind of playful approaches to civic engagement, to say, maybe we should close down our streets and invite people in to talk to their neighbors, to play games in a way that is playful. So I feel like there's in some ways two sides to what we're talking about, the systems and kind of serious simulation side, but also some of the attitude that we try to bring to games. As we kind of wrap up, is there one of those that you feel like our discussion of the Constitution could particularly need? Do we need to stay in the system? Because our default is to turn to its rules and to say the Constitution is about serious things and formal rules. But is it also, should we think about the playful room it leaves for us to experiment with things and even to engage people at the local level?
Yeah, I was walking through the exhibits downstairs, and there's a huge lenticular downstairs, and it's got the Founding Fathers, and then as you walk, the Founding Fathers change into a variety of modern people. And I loved that thing because it said, you are the players, but you can still change the rules to this system. You are just as important, or can be, as the people who wrote this revered document. I think the challenge with playfulness is, like I threw out a random constitutional amendment thought of a friend. Some people in here probably curled at that thought. They're like, oh God, that sounds terrible. I've heard way worse than that. But I think if you sat down with people and said, we're going to talk about all the options we can do, the appropriate way to solve a problem, and you brainstorm 50 crazy things, I think there's a worry that someone would say, weren't you in the room when that crazy thing went on the board? So I think the playfulness part is the exploring that I would like to see people do. More exploring of our new definitions of what it means to be American. Like, until Marbury Madison, we didn't know the Supreme Court could overrule a law. Like, these are things that have been discovered over time, and embrace change and be like the founders and do what we can do to make the system better. And that requires some amount of freedom. someone has to be able to throw out some crazy amendment idea and everyone around the room to go, Greg, what are you doing? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But then think about it. So anyway, that's my playfulness, is the ability to not stigmatize people for bringing up topics of conversation, which you don't do in a game.
Absolutely. And there's a great story at the end of the Constitutional Convention, and it sounds apocryphal. It sounds like it was made up, but there's actually very good documentary evidence for it. And that's when Benjamin Franklin, leaves the convention, and he walks out into the street, and he's asked by a woman, Eliza Powell, a woman he knew, well, doctor, what have we? Do we have a monarchy or a republic? And he famously remarks, a republic if you can keep it. And those are very haunting words, if you can keep it, meaning that you have to participate, you have to be involved, you have to be playful. If it's a game, if you're thinking about that analogy, you have to play. You have to be a part of it. So I think that's an important lesson for us to keep.
Yeah. And I think I'm grateful to the archives for having this conversation, I think because it does open some of that playful space to ask different questions, not just how great, important the stakes are, because the stakes are very high, but we also have to have room for that conversation. With that, I think we want to turn over for questions that might come from the audience, since we are streaming, if people could come to the mics. But questions for either our game designer or our historian. Love to hear what you have for Luke and Denver. You seem closest to the mic, so go ahead.
Okay, so the question I have is, how do you define game as a vehicle in education? So especially as it relates to designing a game to educate the Constitution. Because games, I'm an 8th grade civics teacher. And the kids think of game as someone always wins a game, and there's always a loser. So how do you educate it, or how do you define game and education as it relates to a Constitution?
Sure. I don't think you need to define, well, first of all, thanks for being an 8th grade teacher of civics. Yay for you. I don't think you need to define what the game is. What you want to do is game-like activities. So there's a term called gamification, which is where we take elements of games and we overlay them over something else. I gamified my wife's 4th grade homework. So kids got little stickers when they turned it in on time, and kids doing their homework went from 50% to 100% by the end of the year. And that was just using the mentality of games to get people to activate. If you're in 8th grade, though, you're probably looking for more deep knowledge.
Engagement.
Yeah, you're looking for engagement through discovery, right? You want them to get to that discovery on their own. Have everyone win or everyone lose, right? If you're doing the Constitution and the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists can't get together and they don't agree, at the end of the day, everyone loses. Yeah. That's called, there's lots of games of that type being created now, these cooperative games where everybody wins or everybody loses, and they're super fun.
Yeah. Thank you.
And another thing, and just real quickly, I think I think that's a great suggestion. You can also think about situations in the process where there really were winners and losers, right? There were decisions made where some people came out quite well and others didn't. One interesting example, I mentioned the Great Compromise before. We think about this, I think appropriately in almost hallowed terms, that this was the Great Compromise. I think one side came out on top of that, and you can see that by looking at the evidence, seeing at what behavior. Look at the states that ratified the Constitution. Around here, we're used to seeing the Delaware license plate, first state in the nation. Well, they were the first to ratify. 4 out of the first 5 states to ratify were small states. I think if you look at it objectively, the Great Compromise, and certainly Washington and Madison felt this way, the small states came out pretty well on that, keeping equity. And so we have that in our system today where people in states with less population, the Alaskas and the Dakotas and the Wyomings, that only have 1 representative, they get 2 senators. They have a disproportionate power. And so, if we think of that as a game situation, they did pretty well for themselves.
Yeah, and scroll forward to today, you can control the Senate with 18% of the people being represented, which means 9% of the votes.
Wow.
Let's go over here.
Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Sorry.
We talked earlier about the best games for younger people to play as an avenue for education. And so this is sort of a 2-pronged question. I was wondering if there were any actually board games that you would suggest to sort of initiate the sort of collaboration and diplomacy that like massive online multiplayers do, like Risk or Diplomacy, something like that. And then Denver talked a little bit about simulation as an avenue for education, and I was just asking if he could talk a little bit about the power and role that like structured simulation initiatives like Model UN, Model Arab League, Mock Congress can do to help those education initiatives.
Do you want to go first?
Great question. I can?
Sure, go.
I don't have, I feel bad, and maybe there's other audience members that can help contribute ideas. There are great games out there. I think if you do a little bit of looking, you can find them. There's great educational tools. And a lot of them, I think, the kind of exercise I was describing, you don't actually need a product. I think what's nice about the Constitution is that we have all these great biographies of the delegates. And so I think that it allows students to, if we do role-playing exercise, that they can really research and learn about this person, learn about their instincts. And as we were talking about, in terms of simulating the game, thinking about how they might behave. And I think then they learn firsthand the issues, the difficulties that the historical actors were running up against. But you might have more specific suggestions.
So I would like to point you back to the National Archives. They have some wonderful programs, wonderful game-like activities.
They do,
I'm not sure for what ages, but the ones I heard about earlier were amazing. What ages are you thinking about for looking for a game?
Anything under the age of 18?
Oh, 18. So Diplomacy is a game you mentioned. That is a great example of a game with negotiation and backstabbing, which is a thing that happens in politics, I've heard. There's also a great game by two game designers here in the audience on Kickstarter right now called The Partisans, which is about negotiating and moving a government in a path that you want it to go on, which I think is great. Obviously, I'm publishing it. And that was pretty subtle, right?
Subtle plug.
Subtle plug. Other good negotiation games. Any of the secret role games I think are good. Secret role games are games where you all have a role and you're trying to figure out who you are. I'll get back to you with some other answers because I know I have a bunch.
Yeah. I'll throw one out just because it's an interesting example, although I also have a conflict of interest. I'm on the advisory to a group called iCivics, and this is actually a set of games that came out of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's work to raise more awareness around the courts, and it's become, by some measures, the leading civics curriculum, as in it's in more schools than other major like texts and things. Because teachers want to engage their students with a lot of this content, and they've made a whole suite of games, even around things like Do I Have a Right? That's one of their games. So there's an interesting question about, like, we as a democracy, should we be investing in the education of our children in terms of making games that pull people through? For the most part right now, we really struggle to fund schools in terms of that kind of the infrastructure of buildings and teacher salaries, and what's left over for really interesting simulations is really, really tiny. To me, this part of a conversation like this can also raise questions about how much of an investment are we making in the infrastructure to teach young people civics. I think it's tiny, and much more could and must be done. And I think games are a great place to say we should be asking for that.
Yeah, I will say that all the geography I learned pre-college was from board games. So even if you play a board game that doesn't have an obvious political slant, you're going to start to realize the borders of Poland changed from World War II, right? It's going to be a thing that you learn.
Thank you.
Sure.
There's a question over here. Yeah, please.
So much of what so many of you have said have resonated very much with me. I used to work for the chair of a state legislative committee who was so disillusioned with the process that he spent most of his last year in office playing SimCity.
Which was probably very rewarding, right? You zone things and it works better and traffic gets good.
It was very rewarding for him, but didn't do that much for the legislature or for his staff. Luke, you mentioned that testing is hard, and I think you also mentioned that we have 50 laboratories. It's a kind of a disappointment to me that the title of this panel is Game Design and the Constitution and not Game Design and the U.S. Constitution. I know this is the National Archives, but we have 50 states, each with its own constitution. And you could maybe use game design theory to approach state constitutions as well as the U.S. constitutions. That's a suggestion.
Yeah.
One of you mentioned something about a constitutional convention every 20 or 30 years. That was Thomas Jefferson's idea, that each generation should have its own revolution. My question, and I am going to get to a question. My question is, Luke, you said early on that games are supposed to be fun and fair, and that's not necessarily the way we design our society or our politics. And I guess I disagree, and I wonder if you haven't all, during the course of this panel, come to the conclusion that if we're going to have civic engagement, we actually need to make politics fun and not just fair. We need a design of the system that makes participation sufficiently fun that we have more participation.
Yeah, I would say that would fall under, for me, the category of gamification, right? If you got a special sticker on your license plate or every time you voted, right? That's a public statement of civic engagement. It would become a point of pride. That would be taking something from the game, getting stars, leveling up, powering up.
It's like the I voted sticker, but permanent.
But longer lasting, right? And now people care, right? Oh, I don't trust Steve in a political conversation because Steve's only got 1 star, but Janet's got 4 stars on her license plate. She totally cares. So I think we could make it, we could take elements of games. I think that the challenge with fun is fun and serious. Sometimes they're viewed as opposites. I don't view them that way, but a lot of people do. Sort of like luck and skill are viewed as opposites, and I don't view them that way either. But it's a great question, and I like your comments too. They were very good.
Branch Rickey once said, luck is the residue of design. Branch Rickey, some of you may know, was the baseball executive who brought Jackie Robinson to the major leagues.
Yeah.
And he said, luck is the residue of design.
I like that.
Yeah.
There's a great notion in games that you want to give players information on their state in the game, like where they are, where they're and the thing about points is it's easy to misunderstand points and think if we just add points to things, give people points for voting, that'll make it fun. But actually, that's like a terrible approach, a really shallow, missing kind of how games actually work. Points often work best because they give you feedback. In the same way, being incredibly wealthy, if you're really, really rich, the money is not about like, oh yes, I really needed that extra money. They're a way of just keeping track of like where you're doing and what can you get feedback on. So I think an interesting challenge for our democracy, if we want to make it fun, let's not do gamification too literally. Let's not just add, which I'm sure you would never, your stuff is way too interesting. I know you would never do this, but I feel like there are a lot of people out there, because games are having kind of an interesting ascent where people are saying we can do things with them, we'll add points and leaderboards on democracy and that'll make it fun. I think actually if we want to give people good feedback, we should show them you came and you did this civic action, what was the consequence? Showing people the consequences of their civic involvement, that's actually more like games. Good feedback loops are how games do well.
Yep.
And if you express that through points, that's fine. Capitalism might say, let's express it through dollars, which I don't know how well that has worked at times. But thinking about feedback loops as a way to get there as well could help. Another question over here?
This question is for anyone on the panel, but I feel like looking at the way Congress is elected, that because they're elected by states and by districts, that if there was ever a choice for any of those politicians to make between the national best interest or any other best interest and whatever regional, local, state, district interest, they will always go with the one that keeps their constituents happy at the cost of everybody else. I was wondering if you guys agreed that was a problem, if you guys knew of a way to maybe alleviate that problem with a patch or an update, or if it's always been a problem, because maybe it feels more like a problem these days than it used to.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about the exploits and the problems, I think the best, and I got this from your series, gerrymandering is one of our biggest problems. And so when you say that a member of Congress is serving just his or her district, it's even more narrow than that, right? It's sort of a slice of a slice. And so our system is the only one where it's not necessarily the voters that are picking the representatives, but the representatives are picking their voters through gerrymandering, right? Yeah. And so, that's one thing that's come out of this conversation. I think this exercise that's one of the real design flaws we have right now.
I think if you put 2 game designers in a room or 20 game designers in a room and said fix that problem, we'd have 20 fixes. The challenge is, we have lots of challenges. First of all, I mentioned earlier, you can control the Senate with 18%, only representing 18% of the population, which means you only really need 9% of the vote of the nation, and you control the Senate, right? That's a huge challenge, because then when the nation needs to get something done, you're at the behest of those 18%. I think you could institute gerrymandering reform that would include some randomness, shifting borders. I don't know where the borders are going to be, so I can't know exactly who to pander to in my, doesn't have to shift a lot, just a little bit, right? I'm not going to pander to this one company because they might not be in my district next year. But it is definitely challenging. We don't view, as I mentioned earlier with that ridiculous suggestion, we don't view members of Congress as national figures, they're state figures. And I think as the world has grown, I think an idea like yours of making them more national figures is a good one.
He was first, I think.
All right.
That's the kind of civility we need.
Well performed.
Good evening. Again, this is a question for the entire panel. You mentioned the amendments to the Constitution as being patches, but specifically the 13th, 14th, and 15th happened after a civil war. Is that considered like a system failure? And if it is, how do we change that narrative or do a game design around a system failure?
It was a huge system failure, right? I think,
Yes.
I think when we talk about the success of the Constitution, and historians often do, it's often talked about as the longest, running, written document for a national government in the world, which is true. The longest running one is actually the Massachusetts state constitution. But we conveniently forget the Civil War, right? And in many respects, that's an outgrowth of the founding era and the Constitution. And one of the great exploits of the original Constitution, and maybe it wasn't even an exploit because it was legal, is the 3/5 clause, which gave disproportionate power to the slave-owning class, right? And that just exploded as slavery exploded in the years before the Civil War. That was a system failure.
Yeah, I completely agree. It was a problem built into our system, and we knew it was a problem. The founders knew slavery was going to be a huge issue. They tried to put it off, and they couldn't come to an agreement, and that was the result. So I agree with you 100%. I think there's no way you can't look at that as a failure. What's interesting is we didn't start over. We just added 3 amendments. So at some level, people thought what we had at the core was still worth keeping. We just need to update with the times, much like we've done to other large issues. Great question.
So earlier somebody mentioned kind of the I think wide agreement on things like election security, and I was actually at the public release earlier today at the National Academies of the report they did, the consensus study on election security, and they did a really good job of kind of not really of saying here's what needs to happen, but not really naming people who should do it. But what do you do when, for example, you have, let's say, I'm going to name names, the White House, kind of blocking efforts to do that, and what do you do when you have states that are kind of reluctant to actually say we need to make sure that the votes are counted correctly and accurately? So what do you do when you have kind of disagreement about kind of how to make sure that actually the criteria for victory are actually accurately counted?
I'm going to channel a good friend of mine, Ryan Dancy, who says all the time to me when we talk politics, we're the United States of America, not the United People of America, and that causes huge issues when things get nationalized. And if you view the Congress as a national body, it's a huge issue. I don't know how you get consensus around tough issues. Generally, the ones that have worked, when our norms change as a society, the norms that change for the better almost always come from the bottom up. And I think some of these things we're a little slow for, but we tend to get there eventually. So I'd like to think that we're going to get there on that issue, because I actually think it's the easiest game design fix of all time. Like, I think, again, like gerrymandering, I think 99% of the people want something done. They're just maybe not as angry about it yet as they need to be. Maybe we need to have a bigger system failure, but I'm right there with you.
In some ways, I feel like the question is also about how do we have a political constituency in support of this? And it's in political constituency in support of process, which I think game design people should really get, and possibly game players. So one benefit, if we were to start building the literacy of our populace around games, which actually, frankly, there's a lot of people that play games, but are not super literate in how games work, like defining game mechanics in the way that, like, if you read books, you probably know what narrative is. But people don't have the language to analyze games, I think, quite often, even people that play them incredible amounts. So equating playing at games a number of hours with game literacy, not necessarily the same. If we build more game literacy, I think that it could help build that constituency. A little bit of a circuitous argument, but I actually think more broadly, our democracy does need people who are interested in process. Like who say we need good process, not just outcomes. And if game design can be a way we get there, there are a lot of gamers out there, and there are some efforts to mobilize them politically. For the most part, it's around like free speech issues, kind of games and censorship. Don't censor my games. But what if we kind of pivoted a little of that constituency and said, we want fairness in our political system, just like we want fairness in our games? I don't think that like those type of organizing opportunities are impossible, and in fact, I think they're probably growing.
We don't make for good TV when we do that, though. And it's as silly as that sentence sounded, like a talk about process is not going to get a lot of clicks online, right? It's pretty dry. It's pretty obvious and common sense stuff like you're bringing up. It's obvious that we should fix this solution. You don't get much in the rage economy of the online world today. You don't get a lot of clicks on obvious, which is, we could change.
Yep.
Like, I view games as a liberal art study. I think everyone should take a class on game studies, just like cinema studies and literature studies, art studies. I think it's in that space right now.
Yes.
Okay, I have two quick comments. One, I have an idea for points for if you vote. Each time you vote, you get more opportunities to reply on social media. If you do not vote, you cannot reply to any texts or any social media. And you get more points for voting, general or midterms. So I think maybe we should explore that as a reward thing for voting. You get more opportunities. You don't vote, you are not allowed to respond on social media. That was one quick. The other thing I wanted to say was, I grew up in a game-playing household. With him, Luke, that's my baby
sister.
brother. Yeah. And I worked the last 10 years in the Maryland General Assembly, staffing the chair for a committee. And my boss is retiring after 42 years in the state legislature. She enjoys the job of legislating. And I have seen over the last 10 years, the people who enjoy it and find the fun in it do better at the job. If you are miserable there making policy and helping constituents, you do a poor job. So the connections between the gaming and the policy, because it is a process, and there is a lot of the same skills that you use in games, like following the rules, cooperating with the people on your team, talking to people on the other team if they've got something that you need and you need. I think this all translates beautifully. It's just like a big mashup of my life here happening on the stage. But here's my question. In terms of games, how do you view the current political system? The situation where we're not the system, the players in the game right now, because we've got a disruptor, and I'm not going to make this partisan, but in the game world, what do you call somebody who gets there and doesn't want to play by the rules? And they're talking a lot now about it. Is it a constitutional crisis that we're having? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of conversation about, what is it, the 25th Amendment? Mm-hmm. Is the president fit to serve? How do you respond to a situation like that in a game? When you've got somebody like we currently have in the White House. His team members aren't always playing for his team now, apparently, we know. But how do you view that through the game theory?
I can go because it's my sister.
You have to answer that one.
First or last.
And
we definitely don't want to talk about that.
In games, the person who comes in and does things totally different is generally considered an innovator and is looked back in history positively. It might sound weird, but the first football team to do the forward pass, right? Guy's considered a genius. He had like 5 new football strategies. So coming in and shaking things up and doing things differently in a spectator sport is usually looked at as genius, right up until the point the league gets smart and changes the rules if the spectators don't like the game. So let's take it a different way into a sport. Let's say I'm a hockey team, and I find like Guinness World Book of Record, largest man in the world, and I make him my goalie. And he literally takes up the entire goal left to right when I put pads on him. That will probably be allowed for 1 season, right? But for that 1 season, that coach is a genius. Like, that is a great move. No one ever scores a goal. Win for me, because there's no rule about that in hockey. The challenge in our system is we don't change quickly. Nothing about our political change process is fast by design, as you mentioned. It's a good thing, but when an exploiter comes along in that system, we can end up in some pretty bad spots. Like historically, I'm sure you have lots of other suggestions from history, so we don't get partisan.
Yeah, but I like it. I think I'm going to, good.
I think question also gets a little to the agency you have if you actually are enjoying your job as part of this too. And I think there are some people in our political environment who have a lot of fun. What about people that are excluded, that are marginalized, that have been marginalized for decades and generations? Guess what? The game, not so much fun. So I think if you're in the game, part of my answer might be, well, if you're at the top and that's fine and you have tons of money and if things go south, you might just go to another country or maybe build a rocket. Some people seem to be doing that if they have a lot of money. So it's at the top, it's almost a different kind of a perspective and different game. And I think that asking who thinks it's a game and who's having fun is actually not a bad way to analyze it and to ask, can we get more people in that game who are trying to disrupt? If there's only one person that can, how did we get here? What are we going to do next season? It's a good question. Let's see, over the mic.
Earlier, you made the point that 18-year-olds were able to vote now when they made the amendments, and women were able to vote, and black people were able to vote. Do you think that kids should be able to vote, and do you think, what will that change in our system today, if that is allowed?
How young are you thinking?
16. So.
There was an article written about that.
Yeah.
16.
No, it's a really interesting question, and just as we said, in the Vietnam era, if someone's old enough to go to war, they should be able to vote. There's a lot of things that 16-year-olds do, that they work, they drive, they do different things. So I think that's an interesting idea. This is something that is really fascinating about the American system. During the American Revolution, there was this argument against the British idea of virtual representation. Right? The American revolutionaries said no taxation without representation. And the British came back and said, oh, well, you are represented. You're represented virtually. Each member of parliament looks out for everyone, in the empire. Well, the Americans replaced that system with a more direct form of representation. Yet we still have virtual representation in our system, and I think young people are the biggest example of that. For a long time, it was women, and of course, there's other groups that aren't allowed to participate, and so. I think part of the point is, and this is why the revolution happened, it doesn't always work, right? The virtual representation depends on the goodwill of others and others looking out for the best interests of certain groups. And so I think I'm backing into an argument for 16-year-old voting. Yeah.
So when I asked my game designer friends for crazy amendments that I could talk about and we could discuss, I'm not going to go into this, but it's the opposite of that. What if you couldn't vote after 67 and a half? Right? What if you stop being able to vote? Because voting should be, their argument to me was voting should be about looking forward, right? And then your job should be to teach people younger than you how to vote effectively. But at 67 and a half, you're done. All the systems you voted for are in place. That was a fascinating idea. So voting age, I just find it's a fascinating discussion. Mm-hmm. Great question.
Yeah, and states as the maybe place where we could experiment with a little of this. This is my researcher side. I'm just like, let's do some more of these experiments. That sounds fascinating. What if we get a lot of people moving to Arizona because that's the place where you can vote if you're 16? I think that the federal state thing actually hasn't gone away, and maybe I'm interested on the state side in using that as a place for doing more of these kind of experimentation.
And this is one thing, one place where the Constitution punted, the framers punted on the question of voting. They left it really entirely to the states. I mean, it's not defined in the Constitution the original Constitution, who can vote. So I think that's a good suggestion. It's always been at the state level.
Hi. So my question is, in what ways do you see the game changing with our current administration? Maybe in terms of gaps or exploits in the design that are now surfacing?
Moving forward?
Yes.
So I was telling these folks backstage, I did an analysis of all the exploits we haven't used yet, and it's terrifying. What was your comment at the second part?
I was joking. All of Article 2 is an exploit.
Okay.
I mean, there's so much power involved in that office, and and it really has depended on certain norms and restraints.
Yeah.
So
I would say look at all of the things in the Constitution where a particular branch of government is given a job, and then see if they were given a time limit on getting that job done. This is a very long topic, but stalling is a legitimate strategy in almost every sport. In football, you take a knee, you let the clock run down. We saw that in the last Supreme Court justice in the last Senate, which legitimately good strategy, good exploit, well done. As a game player, pure game analysis, that's what I would say. And we didn't fix it. No one's come forward and said, okay, you have 60 days. Right? So I think the exploiting is going to get worse before it gets better, and maybe we'll have that moment where people are unhappy. So I think oddly Americans agree on a lot more than we think we do when we get outside of our partisanship. I think we actually agree on a lot of structured concepts.
One thing maybe I'll add is that it's easy to think about games just as rules, but I think often culture shapes how we play too. When you're playing in a game of soccer, there are lots of things that maybe the rules wouldn't forbid you to do. Systematically never passing to the guy you don't like. That's okay, but that's like not nice, and maybe it would hurt your team. But there are the examples grow and grow when you get to more culturally interesting systems. And I think in democracy, part of the reason we haven't exploited so many things is actually the rules are more cultural than they are formal for a lot of things. So thinking right now about the cultural rules alongside the formal rules, I think is a good moment for that. What are the values that are holding us and constraining us alongside the formal system?
Yep. Way more unwritten rules than written ones. There's no rule in chess that says you can't punch your opponent. There's not one, but it doesn't happen. So hopefully we don't get to chess punching, although that is, I've been told, the sport. Chess boxing is a thing. You play chess and then you box for a round. I don't get it.
All right, well, with that, I think we're at time. I couldn't read the sign from here, but yes. We're at time. Thank you so much. Let's give one round. Is there a question?
Nope.
One more question?
You're at the mic.
I actually didn't have a question. I just wanted to mention two things really quickly. Y'all were asking about games. I am a huge gamer. Really good games are Founding Fathers by Jason Matthews and Christian Leonard, who are local game designers. It's actually a game where you play the Founding Fathers and write the Constitution. Another one is 1775 by Academy Games. They have lots of historical games and actually do teaching manuals with their games. I've used them a lot in schools. And another one that is a Meritocracy, which is a more modern game about the political environment and especially how the media relates to it.
Awesome.
But those are some games.
Thank you.
If you didn't get that, go talk to her when she's done.
Yeah, and I think that one note just on that is there are a ton of games out there. Even this isn't like 1%, this isn't 1/10%. There are so many games out there. But just like books, there are also a lot of books which aren't particularly good. So I think that try them and share them around, and we need to start celebrating the really good ones. Let's elevate the good ones and get more people playing them. And also, let's hold the bad ones accountable. I think that we should celebrate the Constitution for its good things, but criticize the things that aren't working. We should ask the same of some of our games. Any closing remarks that either of you would like to make?
I think I've said everything I need to say.
All right.
This has been incredibly valuable. Thank you.
All right.
I just want to thank the National Archives.
Yes, thanks to the National Archives for hosting us. This has been a great conversation. Thank all of you for coming.
And I challenge any game designer to come here. It's awesome. Thank you. And not want to make a game. It's so good. Yay.